This video is sponsored by Readly, of whom more in a bit. There are certain streets that are synonymous with certain professions. Harley Street is famous for medicine, Old Bailey for crime and its friend punishment, and Fleet Street is known for journalism, even though it hasn't been the centre of British journalism for the thick end of 40 years. Fleet Street is a very old street indeed. It takes its name from the River Fleet, which is buried at the eastern end. It certainly existed in the 2nd century, but it is almost certainly older. That it should have become the headquarters of the press is kind of an accident of geography. When the Romans first settled here, they built their own town around the port at London Bridge. The road that's now Fleet Street led into it. When they left in the 5th century, their city, Londinium, fell into ruins. Under Alfred the Great, the old city was recolonised and named Londonburg. Then the Saxons built their own town, Londonwick, about a mile to the west in the 7th century. Under Edward the Confessor, the Palace of Westminster and Westminster Abbey were built. So essentially London was two cities, business in Londonburg, government and religion in Londonwick. So it is to this day. And running between the two, Strand and Fleet Street, perfectly situated to pick up on events as news travelled between the two centres. Now, to have the press, you need, well, the press. The printing press was probably brought to England by William Caxton in 1476. He based himself in Westminster, but that's because his main customers were the church. The printing press had a massive impact on society. Since most people didn't have access to the written word, there was no standard form of the English language, and it could vary massively over a very short distance and a very short space of time. As Caxton himself observed, certainly it is hard to please every man by cause of diversity and change of language. Well, quite. Yet it was Caxton who'd changed that, or change it, with his publishing house. His books were published in Chancery English, the dialect used in London. Suddenly, anyone could get access to the written word, and Chancery English became the standard. Caxton's assistant, Wynkyn de Worde, took over. Now, I understand that everybody's heard about de Worde, but nevertheless his story is relevant. He was very much a man of business, who produced and sold his books cheaply. He took over on Caxton's death, and in 1500 he moved his business to an address near St. Bride's, identified as the Sign of the Sun. In an age before widespread literacy, addresses were given through symbols rather than names and numbers. The pawnbroker's 3 bulls and the barber's striped pole are both relics of this practice, as is giving pubs names. Now, in the time between Fleet Street being established as the link between the centres of London and de Worde setting up shop, a lot had happened. It was also the centre of the legal profession. The Carmelites and the Knights Templar, ecclesiastical organisations who had a high level of literacy, were also based there. Wynkyn was hugely successful. His work was often sensationalist, and certainly he wasn't too worried about who he offended. In 1535 he went too far and offended both the king and the government with his book The Complaint of the Too Soon Martyred. His press was confiscated by the crown, but it didn't matter much, because he died that same year. Of natural causes, I hasten to add. The press was re-established in Blackfriars under direct royal control. Other printing houses were opened along Fleet Street, but they had to run everything past the stationers' company at the King's Printer. Now, there may have been a lot of publications on Fleet Street, but that's nothing compared to today's sponsor, Readly. Readly is a magazine reading app that gives you access to thousands of titles. And rather than having to seek out shady pamphlet sellers in your local pub, Readly lets you access them on your phone, your tablet, or whatever device you like. I suppose you could access it in a pub if you want that old-school feeling. You can even download magazines to read offline. And yes, there are newspapers as well, take that Fleet Street. You can search by subject if you're looking for something in particular, and the app will suggest other titles you might enjoy based on what you're already reading. There are even back issues. I do a lot of my research through magazine articles, and I used to be the kind of guy who had stacks of back issues because they had useful information, and because I had no shame. As soon as I tried Readly out and saw how convenient it was, those stacks went straight in the recycling. I can get all the information I want on my phone, and now I have a lot more space. With a single, low monthly subscription, you can browse as much as you want without having to pay any extra. It's great if you're researching. Now this article appears relevant to my interests. Saxon London, wasn't I talking to you about that just now? Wait, these guys say it's Londonborough? Well, I feel stupid. Anyway, if you don't want to feel stupid, increase the breadth of your knowledge with a subscription to Readly. You'll never be bored again. If you click on the link in the description below, you can get access to an exclusive offer for viewers of this channel of 2 months free, and you can cancel at any time if you don't love it. And yes, I realise it is ironic to have a video about the newsprinting industry sponsored by an app that makes it obsolete, but what can I say, we live in the future now. Speaking of the future, let's get back to the past. You know, back when the old media was still the new media. In the face of censorship, an underground printing industry developed. Fleet Street was for the gentleman printer and the government propagandist. But around Clerkenwell, Holborn and Cripplegate, printers set up who'd make their money distributing less official news. Pamphlets compiling gossip and rumours. Not that the official press was much more reliable. Being under government control, it invariably suppressed news that made England look bad and played up the sins of her enemies. In fact, for actual useful news, businessmen turned to imported newsletters from Europe known as Corantos, which were translated on Fleet Street under the censor's watchful eye. In 1637 there was a crackdown on the press, partly because the news coming from Europe was not favourable to England, but also because of some unfortunate misprints in Bibles that had recently arisen. Most notably the 1631 edition that stated in Deuteronomy Book 5, verse 24, that the Lord hath showed us his glory and his great ass. It's known as the Adulterer's Bible because it also commands that thou shalt commit adultery. But worse was to come for Fleet Street. The English Civil War from 1642 to 1658 led to a strange situation. London, like the rest of the country, was divided between the Crown and Parliament. Westminster was very royalist, whereas the City of London was firmly parliamentarian. Fleet Street, being neither, became a no-man's land. Rubbish was not collected, the watchmen didn't patrol, and disgraced clerics performed dubiously legal wedding ceremonies. The area gained the nickname of Alsatia after the disputed territory between France and Germany. But the presses kept going, with the news becoming more propagandist than ever. The Royalists published Mercurius Aulicus, or the Court Mercury, and the Parliamentarians Mercurius Britannicus, or the British Mercury. These ceased trading in 1645 after a long and unrelated dispute over a scurrilous story involving a parliamentary soldier, a horse, and no trousers. The papers sprang up again later, printing stories of such low quality that they made the Weekly World News look like Reuters. When Oliver Cromwell's parliamentarian forces won the war, it led to, yes, another crackdown. Cromwell was a Puritan, and as such, rather puritanical. The clue's in the name. He outlawed theatres, Christmas, and you can bet he outlawed scandal sheets. You would think that the death of Cromwell and the ascension of King Charles II would have improved matters, but if anything, censorship actually got worse under the so-called Merry Monarch. There followed a sort of tug-of-war between the need to provide information and the perceived need to ruthlessly suppress material deemed seditious. The penalty for producing seditious material was imprisonment in the notorious Newgate, although the most severe cases were punished with hanging, drawing, quartering, and having your bits displayed as a lesson to others. Ian Hislop got off pretty lightly when you think about it. Fate intervened in 1666. A fire that started in a bakery in Pudding Lane destroyed most of the old city, including Fleet Street, and especially including the house of the King's printer. The king was penniless, in the owns huge amounts of land and several palaces sense of penniless, and couldn't afford to pay for rebuilding. Businesses in London did have money. and since they were going to be paying for the new London, they had the king by the crown jewels. Censorship would be relaxed, and that was well timed because a new era of news distribution was about to begin. In 1652, a new fad had taken London by storm: the coffee house. Coffee quickly became known as the fuel of business. It didn't intoxicate like beer or wine, and it was far safer than water. Gentlemen would meet at coffee houses and discuss the business of the day. Certain coffee houses became known for certain types of businessmen, and some even grew into major institutions. Lloyd's Coffee House, for instance, was popular with maritime gentlemen and would become the insurance market now known as Lloyd's of London. Naturally, they became places for the distribution of news, customers for the quality papers, and sources for enterprising journalists. From the end of the 17th century, things moved fast. In 1695, the Licensing Act lapsed, in theory creating freedom of the press, but since the sedition laws were still in place, that didn't amount to much. In 1702, Elizabeth Mallet founded the Daily Courant, which derived its name from the old Courantos and promised a level-headed presentation of the news, free of bias and opinion. It was also the first daily paper. In 1712, the introduction of stamp duty killed a lot of the cheaper newspapers. In the 1730s, literary magazines began to appear, which did criticise the government, but did so in such pretty language that the government were willing to let it slide. After all, the majority of people probably weren't even going to read these. The 18th century was a remarkable time for Fleet Street, seeing such luminaries as Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, Henry Fielding, Samuel Johnson, Daniel Defoe, and Voltaire. People came from all over Britain in the hope of meeting these men of letters in their natural habitat. Less well-known, but no less notable, were John Gurney, the inventor of shorthand, and William Woodfall. Known as Memory Woodfall, he was capable of memorizing an entire day's proceedings in the House of Commons, which was more than a little unnerving to MPs who thought they were protected by the rules against note-taking. The last quarter of the century, though, saw government opinion once again turning against freedom of the press. Britain lost her American colonies in 1776, and the French Revolution led a number of political thinkers to ask, but why can't we have one of those? The government became paranoid about calls for reform lest they lead to the king undergoing some unwanted neck surgery. Meanwhile, the gulf between rich and poor grew, not helped by the Industrial Revolution, the rising price of food, and an economic slump. Things came to a head in 1819 with the Peterloo Massacre, when a protest in Manchester demanding electoral reform was met with an unprovoked cavalry charge, killing 18 unarmed civilians and injuring hundreds more. Fleet Street's journalists were outraged and made sure that the world knew who was to blame. But rather than learn the lesson that ruthless repression will backfire, the government decided that the problem was that they hadn't been repressive enough. The 6 Acts were passed in 1819. 2 of them were direct attacks on the press. The Blasphemous and Seditious Libels Act allowed writers deemed guilty of blasphemous or seditious libels to be transported for up to 14 years. The Newspaper and Stamp Duty Act punished the guilty and innocent alike by imposing stamp duty on publications dealing in opinion, which had previously been exempt from the tax on newspapers. The thing is, none of this actually stopped people from printing anti-government opinions. It just meant that the things they said had to be true. And when the government was seemingly against both the people and the press, it made for a strong alliance. People looked to the press for information, and actual seditionists could find sanctuary on Fleet Street. Thomas Barnes, the first editor of the Times, was referred to as the most powerful man in the country by the Lord Chancellor, and indeed, firmly within the law, he successfully agitated for reforms. The 19th century brought revolution to Fleet Street in a different sense. Mechanisation improved production and railways improved distribution. This century would see many familiar names begin publication, such as The Spectator, The Telegraph, The Economist, and The News of the World, among many others. But the expansion of the press brought its drawbacks. The old notion that the news should be limited to the right sort of people would no longer fly. Newspapers had to appeal to everyone. That meant a return to the lowest common denominator: sensationalism and scandal. News editors saw themselves as influencers of public opinion rather than mere reporters. W.T. Stead pioneered what would become known as the New Journalism. This combined facts with opinions and presented the news as clearly as possible for a mass market, incorporating American innovations such as subheadings and illustrations. Stead started the ball rolling, but Alfred Harmsworth, better known as Lord Northcliffe, picked it up and ran with it. Northcliffe was the founder of the Daily Mail in 1896 and the Daily Mirror in 1903. He would also take over the Times, the Sunday Times, and the Observer, as well as founding or purchasing several other publications. By 1914, he would control approximately a third of Britain's papers. As such, he wielded enormous power and was even able to influence politics. He was arguably responsible for putting David Lloyd George on the path to becoming Prime Minister, and his patriotic agitation during the First World War made him a target for German assassins. Depending upon who you ask, he was either a giant of journalism or the worst thing to happen to Fleet Street since Sweeney Todd. He changed the very nature of British news reporting, and we still feel his influence to this day. The 20th century saw much physical change to the street. The whole lot was widened between 1880 and 1914. In 1928, the Telegraph acquired a bold Art Deco building, very much in line with the fad for Egyptian-style architecture. In 1932, the Daily Express put up an incredibly modernist headquarters. These might be viewed as statements, representations of the power of the press. To some, this was a golden age of journalism, and to others, Fleet Street was the street of shame. The end of the era came in 1986. Computerization had opened up new possibilities. In the case of press baron Rupert Murdoch, it opened up the possibility of moving away from Fleet Street and the influence of print workers' unions. So the Times and the Sun upped sticks and headed off to Wapping. Strikes and protests were held in both Fleet Street and Wapping, but ultimately to no avail. The fact was that it was now possible to produce newspapers with a tenth of the print workers needed before. This was one of a number of high-profile defeats that reduced the power of trade unions in the UK. With the Murdoch papers moving out, others followed. These days, only a handful of publications retain offices on Fleet Street. Yet the name remains. We still say on Fleet Street when talking about the press. The history of the street is a history of balance, of the need to inform versus the need to control. The balance of power has long since shifted. Where once the government firmly kept its foot on the neck of the press, now the press sways the government. Then as now, between the money and the power, lies Fleet Street. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I'd like to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon and here on YouTube for your generous donations. You are the metal to my press. I would also like to thank Readly for sponsoring today's video. Click on the link in the description below to take advantage of their generous offer. And I will see you all again very soon. Cheerio.